Okay, welcome back. We're reading this paper, Coffee and Cancer of the Pancreas. We just went through all the tables. Now we're going to go through the methods section. And so that's a little bit down here. And so it looks like they did a case control interview study, which we kind of figured out already, in 11 large hospitals in the Boston area and Rhode Island between October 1974 and August 1979. They excluded some patients. They excluded ones who had tumors of the islet cells, the periampullary duodenal mucosa, and the ampulla of Vater. I don't know why those ones are specifically singled out, but they are. And so they found 578 patients. They interviewed 405 of them. Then they said a bunch of them were eventually discharged. Some were too sick to be interviewed. Some had language difficulties. 26 refused the interview, and also excluded were 8 non-white patients. Why are you excluding non-white patients? I don't know. That's interesting, right? 4 residents of countries other than the United States, maybe because they have different exposures in other countries. Okay, I can see that. And what else? Information was judged to be anything that they thought that was of questionable reliability. And so they ended up with 369 patients. Then they got a control series, right? So they had to find patients that somewhat matched. So they found patients who were under the care of the same physician in the same hospital at the time of the interview with the person who had pancreatic cancer. And so then they excluded anyone that they already knew ahead of time their smoking and alcohol history. They also excluded some other people with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, bladder cancer, peptic ulcer, and so they found 18 eligible patients, and again, they had to exclude a whole bunch of people for a bunch of various reasons, including the non-whites. And then they also excluded the unreliable ones, and then that's how they got to 644 patients. Then they give us here a little bit more example of who the control series was. 273 of them had cancer, other kinds of cancer, other than pancreatic and biliary tract. And 371 of them had some other disorder. They even tell us what kind of cancer those patients had. They had breast cancer, they had colon and rectum, stomach cancers, small intestine, ovary, prostate, cervical, melanoma, lymphoma. And then they also admit here that because these are GI doctors, they probably had an over representation of people with gastroenterologic conditions when you compare them to a general hospital population. And so here you can read stuff about the different GI diseases that were in the other patients. And then they compared our pancreatic cancer patients to both of those control groups, right? The ones with cancer and the ones without cancer. And they said, hey, they were about the same. And so they didn't give us those results here, but they said that they did the combined control group. That's what they presented here. Okay, then they asked about the use of cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. They asked about drinking, and they asked what kind of beverages they drank on a typical day for tea and coffee. And then they calculated relative risks, and they calculated confidence limits using this Mantel and Hensel, whatever the heck that method is. And they used some sort of calculator program developed by Rothman and Bryce. They got to give you all this information so that you can reproduce this, and maybe there's an error in the program, and so it's important to say. Now let's go to the results section. We kind of already know what the results are going to say because we already read these, but let's go through them anyway. So we said there's no difference between cases and controls with cigars and pipe tobacco, and they say there's a weak positive association. That's just saying that the relative risk number was 1.2, but the confidence interval was not significant for the use of cigarettes. Now here's something interesting. They say that they found the combined smoking in both sexes to have a relative risk of 1.4 with a confidence interval that is significant, but they didn't put that in the table anywhere. So who knows what that's about? At least, it should at least make you think, what the heck are they doing? Now let's move down and look at the results section for alcohol, and they say Table 2 shows us this, and the combined estimate for men and women was 0.9 with a non-significant confidence interval, and that regular drinking had a relative risk of 0.8, again with a not significant confidence interval. And they're saying it didn't really make a difference what kind of alcoholic beverage they drank. Now let's jump up here to the T section. In the T section, they said they saw a slight inverse association. Remember, slight means, you know what, yeah, it was 0.7, but it was not clinically significant, so who cares? Not significant. Then we go to the coffee, and they say an unexpected association of pancreatic cancer was found here. And they said that for men, there was an increased risk, a statistically significant risk, but there was no dose-responsive relationship, meaning that the more coffee you drink, you weren't any more likely to have pancreatic cancer. And so they also did the same thing here for women, and they said, yeah, they found the ones that drank 3 or more cups had significantly elevated risk. So they did have a dose-response relation, meaning the more coffee they drank, the more likely they were to have pancreatic cancer. And when they combined the two sexes, they said that they found a highly significant risk and relative risk for developing cancer. And those numbers are here. We saw those already at the table. And then we jump down here to the thing that's called interaction. They said they know, since we didn't find any kind of relationship with alcohol, tea, pipe tobacco, or cigars, we didn't do those. So we only looked at cigarettes and coffee use, and that we found a consistent association of pancreatic cancer with coffee drinking across all the smoking categories, even after for adjustment with smoking. And we saw that at the table, right? Now that we've read the methods and we've read the results, it's time for us to come up with our own conclusions. And some conclusions that I might make at this point is, I would say, first, why did you calculate risk ratios? In a case control study, you should really have calculated odds ratios. That would have made more sense, okay? And that they didn't find any real association between any of these other things except for coffee and pancreatic cancer, and there seemed to be an association there. Now, for men, it wasn't dose-related, but for women it was. And does coffee affect women differently than it does men? It doesn't make sense to me. Biologically, that doesn't make any sense. And if coffee is causing it, like they're saying that it is, they're calling it a causal relationship, then you would think that dose relationship should be there for the men as well. So already some of this is looking pretty shady. So let's now read their introduction and their discussion and see how they're explaining it. And so they say, over the past few decades, pancreatic cancer is going up, right? It kills a lot of people. Cigarette smoking has emerged as a relatively weak but consistent risk factor, and they wanted to see what alcohol, coffee, tea, and all those other things do as well. Then we moved to the discussion section, and they said that they also found that weak association between cigarette use and pancreatic cancer that's been previously explored, and it's always been a weakly positive association, and they found pretty much the same thing. Then they moved down here to talk about alcohol use. They said it's not really been studied that much, and they say it seems unlikely that alcohol consumption has any role in the origin of pancreatic cancer. Then they talk about a different study by Lin and Kessler, where people with pancreatic cancer tended to drink more decaffeinated coffee than the controls. It was, again, a case control study. And they think that it wasn't the decaffeinated coffee that was causing the cancer. They say it seems more likely that these decaffeinated coffee drinkers probably drank a ton of normal coffee in the past, and that's why they had increased risk of pancreatic cancer. Then they move on to talk about the use of coffee, the increase in pancreatic cancer in the country, and that it's decreased in Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists, which would be compatible with coffee being a cause. Now, I don't know that Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists abstain from coffee. They may, I don't know that. And then they talk about this case report of this husband and wife that put coffee syrup in their ground coffee before percolating it, and then they both got pancreatic cancer. Okay, let's move down here, because this is where the big meat of it is here. And they talk now about our use of a control group composed of hospitalized patients must be discussed. It is possible that these patients reduced their coffee consumption because of illness, and that their replies were affected, even though the question was related to the time before the onset of the illness. So they're saying that, well, maybe the hospitalized patients who were not pancreatic cancer people stopped drinking coffee for some reason. But they say, no, they didn't, because we asked them how much coffee they drank before the onset of their illness. They also saw that although the majority of our control patients had chronic disease, they say, well, pancreatic cancer is just a chronic disease. And so if you're going to stop drinking coffee because you have a chronic disease, you stop drinking it because if you had pancreatic cancer as well. And so they say that it is inconceivable that this bias would account for the total difference between the cases and the controls. Inconceivable. I do not think that word means what you think it means. And so then they also say here that, look, if the association between coffee consumption and pancreatic cancer is confirmed, if it's confirmed, then that's a problem, right? Because a lot of us drink coffee, and pancreatic cancer is increasing in incidence in the United States. At that time, it was the fourth most common fatal malignant disease. So now let's talk about what the heck happened here. Why did they come up with this, right? And so it really comes down to how they picked their cases and their controls. So remember, who picked all these patients? It was GI doctors, right? And so who are GI doctors going to admit to the hospital? They're going to admit patients with pancreatic cancer, sure. But who else do GI doctors admit to the hospital? They admit patients with tummy aches, right? I say tummy aches, but I mean, abdominal pain. And what makes that tummy ache get worse? Coffee does. So what are the people with the tummy aches not going to drink? They're not going to drink coffee. So now, if you look at this, it makes sense that the control groups were not drinking coffee and the case group was drinking more coffee. They were drinking just a normal amount of coffee, and these people were drinking less than normal because it just made their other problems get worse. And so you can see how this introduced a bias into the study. And so coffee does not cause pancreatic cancer. Phew, dodge that bullet. Unfortunately, the way they designed the study, the patients who were admitted as controls just drank less coffee for a completely other reason. It made their stomach worse. And so I hope that helps. I hope this shows you how one way that you can read a paper, this one we use coffee and the cancer of the pancreas, that you start with the abstract, then go read the tables, then it makes all that other stuff make a little bit more sense, and you can kind of breeze through it much more quickly. And you can make your own decisions instead of coming to the decisions that these people made. Okay? If you have any questions, please put them below in the comments. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.